Little girl went to the well alone each day for her ill mother, until a cowboy asked, "Are you alone?" The sun crept over the far hills, brushing the prairie grass with streaks of amber and fire. A thin mist clung to the earth, and the faint whistle of the wind moved through the tall dry stalks. It was morning in Willow Creek and the land was just beginning to stir. Wagons rolling in town, ranchers calling to their stock, dogs barking from distant porches. But far from the sound of voices and laughter, down a lonely dirt path framed by cottonwoods, a little girl walked alone. Her name was Annie Mae Hensley. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, though the way she carried herself, shoulders stiff, eyes steady, spoke of a soul far older. In her small, calloused hands she gripped a wooden bucket almost as tall as her knees. Each step kicked up dust that clung to her hem and bare feet, yet she didn't slow. Every morning, rain or shine, Annie made that same walk, a half-mile from the cabin she shared with her mother to the old stone well that sat forgotten on the edge of the prairie. The path wound through brittle grass and stones, and sometimes snakes slithered in the warmth of the dawn. She was afraid, of course she was, but fear didn't draw water and her mother's fever wouldn't wait. By the time she reached the well, her arms trembled with weariness. The rope was rough and splintered, the bucket heavy as iron when filled. She knelt, breath puffing white in the cool morning air, and began to wind the rope. The pulley squealed in protest, echoing across the quiet field. "Just a little more," she whispered to herself, straining until her small hands burned. The bucket broke the surface with a wet gasp. Water, clear, cold, shimmering in the early light. She poured it carefully into her pail, splashing only a little. When she was done, she sat back, panting softly, her eyes drifting toward the horizon. She could almost see her cabin from there, a tiny dark shape crouched beneath the hill, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. That smoke meant Mama was still awake, still fighting. Annie's mama, Clara, had been sick since the thaw of spring. Some called it lung fever, others said it was just a long cough, but to Annie it was the sound that haunted every night, the ragged, gasping cough that made her mother's whole frame shake. They used to live as a family, her mama, her daddy, and her. But after her daddy died in the mining collapse last winter, everything changed. Folks in town had been kind at first, bringing stew or bread. But as the weeks dragged on and the sickness stayed, their visits stopped. Now it was just Annie and her mama, and the long walk to the well. She hoisted the heavy bucket with both arms, staggering under its weight. The rim bit into her palms, leaving red marks, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. The path back home shimmered in the morning heat, and the sound of cicadas rose like a living wall around her. Halfway home, she paused to catch her breath beneath the shade of a cottonwood. A bird sang above, bright and carefree. Annie smiled faintly. "If only you could carry water too," she whispered. Then came the sound that made her freeze, hoofbeats. Slow, steady, growing louder. Annie turned sharply, her heart skipping. From around the bend came a man on horseback, tall in the saddle, a shadow cast across the road. The horse was chestnut brown, strong and restless, its mane blowing like silk. The rider reined in, removing his hat as he approached. "Mornin', little miss," he said in a voice deep and kind. "That's a mighty heavy load for someone your size." Annie took a cautious step back, clutching her bucket tighter. "It's for my ma," she said softly, almost defiant. The man dismounted with practiced ease, boots crunching in the dirt. He tied his reins to a branch and crouched so he wasn't towering over her. Up close, she could see the sun-creased lines on his face, the worn leather of his gloves, and the gentleness in his eyes the color of the open sky. "You fetch water for her every day?" he asked. Annie nodded. "Ain't no one else to do it." He tilted his head, studying her. "You live far?" "Just over the ridge," she said, pointing. "Mama sick?" "Been sick a long time." Something flickered across the man's face. Pity, maybe, or memory. He looked at the full bucket, then at her thin arms trembling under its weight. "Tell you what," he said, standing. "Name's Luke Calder. How about you let me carry that for you, Annie Mae?" Annie blinked. You know my name?" He smiled faintly. "You told me just now." She bit her lip, hesitating. Mama always warned her not to trust strangers, especially men passing through. But something about him, the calm in his voice, the way he'd said her name, made her heart ease a little. Finally she nodded. "All right, but don't spill none. Mama needs it." Luke chuckled softly. "Scout's honor." He lifted the bucket with one arm like it weighed nothing and motioned for her to lead the way. As they walked, the prairie wind carried the scent of wild sage. The silence between them wasn't awkward, It was gentle, filled with the rhythm of boots and hooves and a child's small steps beside a man who'd forgotten what it meant to care for someone. When they crested the ridge, Luke saw the cabin for the first time: sagging roof, broken shutter, smoke struggling to rise. It wasn't much, but it was home. And somehow, that sight struck him harder than the endless loneliness of his own ranch. Annie turned to him, eyes bright with trust she hadn't meant to give. "Thank you, Mr. Luke." He tipped his hat. "Any time, sweetheart." As he watched her run inside with the water, Luke felt something shift deep inside, something he hadn't felt since the war ended and left him empty. A thought, quiet but certain, settled in his chest. He couldn't just ride away this time. The sun had climbed high by the time they reached the small cabin nestled in the valley. From a distance, it looked peaceful, a picture of rustic simplicity, but as Luke Calder drew closer, he saw the truth in its weary bones. The roof sagged like a tired back, its shingles warped by storms. The fence posts leaned drunkenly, some already fallen. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, carrying the faint scent of burnt herbs and sickness. Annie skipped ahead, her little feet leaving prints in the soft dirt. She glanced over her shoulder every few steps, making sure Luke hadn't disappeared. "Mama don't like visitors," she warned quietly. "But I reckon she'll be grateful for the water." Luke followed her to the porch, his boots crunching softly. He could see where a man's hand had once built this place, sturdy at its heart, meant to keep a family safe. Now it looked like a ghost of the life it once held. Annie pushed open the creaking door and whispered into the dim interior, "Mama? I got the water, and a man helped me carry it." A soft voice, hoarse and trembling, called from the corner. "A man?" Luke stepped forward into the light that filtered through a cracked window. His hat hung low in his hands as he said gently, "Ma'am, don't mean no harm. Name's Luke Calder. Just saw your girl at the well alone. Figured I'd lend a hand." The woman in the bed stirred. Her hair, once chestnut brown, now lay tangled against the pillow, streaked with silver and damp from fever. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips pale. But her eyes, gray and steady, still carried fire. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself, Mr. Calder," she murmured. "We're fine." Luke set the bucket by the hearth. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am, but I don't reckon that's true." Clara Hensley's gaze softened a fraction, though pride lingered behind her words. "We get by. Don't we, Annie?" Annie nodded eagerly. "We do, Mama. But the roof leaks and I can't fix it. Mr. Luke says he can help." Clara's eyes flicked toward the cowboy, not with trust, but with the guarded look of someone who's learned that help always comes with a price. Luke saw it and raised both palms. "Ain't looking for anything, ma'am. Just figure the good Lord gave me two hands for a reason." Silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. After a moment, Clara turned her head toward the small table beside the bed. "There's a cup there, Annie. Fetch some water, will you?" Annie obeyed, dipping a tin cup into the fresh bucket. She carried it carefully to her mother's lips. Clara drank slowly, her breath shuddering after each swallow. Luke could see how much effort it took her just to breathe, and it twisted something in his chest, a feeling he hadn't let himself feel in years. He glanced around. The room was simple: a cot, a stove, two chairs, and a small table by the window. A few keepsakes hung on the wall: a faded wedding photograph, a cross carved from driftwood, and a child's drawing pinned above the hearth, a family of three holding hands beneath a sun that smiled down on them. Luke turned away before Clara could see the pity in his eyes. "I'll fetch more wood," he said quietly. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but he was already stepping outside. Outside the air felt sharp and clean. Luke loosened the rope from his horse's saddle and began gathering fallen branches near the treeline. He worked without thinking, lost in rhythm: chop, gather, stack. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, and for the first time in months, he felt the kind of purpose that wasn't about cattle or fences. When he came back, Annie was stirring broth in a dented pot. She looked up and grinned. "Mama says you don't need to help, but I think you should." Luke smiled faintly. "Smart girl." He stacked the wood beside the stove and checked the chimney draft. The place could use fixing, bad. He could see daylight between the rafters, and when he touched the wall near the window, cold air slipped through the cracks. "Storms'll find their way in soon," he muttered. Annie tilted her head. "You talk like a man who's seen a lot of storms." He chuckled softly. "You could say that." Clara was half asleep when Luke finished patching the window. The fire crackled warm and steady now. When she stirred again, she found the cowboy still there, sitting in a chair by the door, hat resting on his knee, watching the flames. "I didn't mean to fall asleep," she murmured. "Don't you worry about that," Luke said, standing. "You rest." Annie and I got things covered. She looked at him then, really looked at him. There was kindness in his face, yes, but also weariness, the kind born from loss. She recognized it because she wore the same expression every time she looked in the mirror. "Thank you," she whispered. The words cost her pride, but they came from her heart. Luke tipped his hat. "Anytime, ma'am." He started toward the door, but Annie ran after him. "You'll come back tomorrow, right?" Luke paused. The prairie wind howled low outside, brushing through the cracks in the walls. He looked down at her bare feet, her hopeful eyes, and knew he couldn't walk away from this, not now. "I reckon I will," he said. "You just make sure your mama keeps restin'. Her grin was all the thanks he needed. He stepped out into the fading light, the horizon glowing orange and gold. His horse snorted softly, waiting. As Luke mounted, he turned one last time toward the cabin, that fragile little home tucked against the wild. The sun dipped low behind it, casting long shadows across the valley, and Luke thought of how some souls burned quietly through hardship, like candles in a storm. He gave a small nod to no one in particular and whispered, "See you tomorrow, Annie Mae." Then he rode off, leaving only hoofprints and a promise behind. Morning came soft and golden over the plains. The sound of meadowlarks filled the cool air, and mist still clung to the grass when Luke Calder saddled his horse again. He hadn't slept much the night before. His mind had stayed with the widow and her daughter long after he'd left their little cabin. He told himself he was only going back to check the repairs, to be sure the roof held and the firewood lasted. But deep down he knew it was more than that. There was something about those two, the frail woman and her brave child, that stirred a long-forgotten ache inside him. By the time he reached the valley, Annie was already outside, kneeling by the steps with a wooden bowl in her hands. She was feeding crumbs to a skinny hen, her small face brightening the moment she spotted him. "Mr. Luke," she cried, jumping up. "Mama said you might not come back." Luke swung down from his saddle with a grin. "Well, your mama don't know me too well yet, does she?" He untied a small sack from his saddle horn and handed it to her. "Brought a few things from town, some flour, sugar, and a bit of dried meat. Figured it might come in handy." Annie's eyes widened like it was Christmas. "Mom'll be so happy." She paused, then whispered, "She don't like talking charity, though." Luke chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Ain't charity. It's payment, for you teachin' me that feedin' hens is harder than it looks." That made her giggle, and she led him inside, the screen door creaking behind them. Clara was sitting up when Luke entered, propped against a pillow. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, but her voice was still thin. She tried to stand when she saw him, but Luke motioned for her to stay put. "Brought some supplies," he said, setting the sack down by the table. "And I figured I'd fix that door hinge today. Keeps swinging open." Clara frowned slightly, her pride pricking at the edges. "You don't have to keep doing this, Mr. Calder. You've got your own work, I'm sure." Luke nodded slowly. "That I do. But I've also got more time than sense these days." He smiled just enough to soften the words. "Sides, I like the company." Something in his tone made Clara's protest fade. She looked away, hiding the flicker of warmth that rose in her chest. It had been a long time since a man had spoken to her with simple kindness, without pity or expectation. Annie busied herself showing Luke the broken hinge, chattering about how their rooster crowed at the moon, and how she'd seen a jackrabbit the size of a dog the night before. Luke laughed at her stories as he worked, using the hammer he'd brought from his own ranch. By the time he finished, the door swung perfectly straight. Annie clapped, delighted. "You fixed it. Mama, look." Clara smiled despite herself. "Looks like we owe you supper, Mr. Calder." Luke tipped his hat modestly. "You make the coffee, I'll fetch the water." That evening, as the light dimmed and shadows stretched long across the hills, the three of them sat together by the small table. The stew was simple, beans and dried venison, but Luke swore he hadn't tasted anything that good in years. Annie talked more than she ate, asking him questions faster than he could answer them. "You ever fought a coyote? Do you sleep under the stars? How come your horse listens when you don't even talk?" Luke chuckled between spoonfuls. "One at a time, little lady. And no, I don't fight coyotes, they ain't worth the trouble." Clara watched quietly, a soft smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in months, laughter filled their cabin. The sound was strange but welcome, like music after silence. When the dishes were cleared, Luke helped stack firewood by the stove. He moved easily like he belonged there. When he turned to leave, Clara found herself saying something she hadn't planned. "You're welcome to stop by again, if you're headin' this way." Luke's brows rose slightly. "That an invitation, Mrs. Hensley?" Clara, she corrected gently. He smiled. Then I reckon I'll take it, Clara. From that day on, Luke came often, never overstaying, never prying, just helping. Sometimes he brought food or tools. Other days he brought nothing but stories. He told Annie about his childhood on a cattle ranch, about the war that left him wandering, and about the quiet stretch of land he now tended alone. A place so silent he could hear the wind talk to itself. Annie loved those stories, sitting cross-legged by the fire, eyes wide. "Do you ever get lonely out there?" she asked one evening. Luke looked into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Used to," he said softly. "Not so much these days." Clara didn't speak, but her heart caught the meaning behind his words. By summer, the rhythm between them had settled like the beat of a heart. Luke would ride in after dawn, fix a fence or fetch water, then share supper before heading home. He brought seeds for the garden, taught Annie to mend tack, and even carved her a small wooden horse she named Whisper. But not everyone saw it kindly. Whispers began in town, folks at the mercantile, men at the saloon. "You seen Calder hangin' around that widow again?" one man sneered. "Man's lost his sense." Another spat tobacco and said, "Either he's pitying her, or courting her. Either way it's trouble." Luke heard their talk one day while buying grain. He didn't bother responding. But when one of them made a cruel remark about Clara being too proud to beg but happy to take a man's company, Luke's fist found the man's jaw before his mind caught up. The saloon went silent as the man hit the floor. Luke stood over him, calm as stone. "You talk about her or that little girl again, you'll need more than whiskey to fix what's comin' next." He left before anyone could answer. The door swung shut behind him and the wind swallowed the gossip whole. That evening, he rode back to the cabin with a quiet heaviness in his chest. When Clara opened the door, she saw the bruise on his knuckle. "You been in a fight?" she asked, worry flickering in her eyes. He shrugged. "Just settlin' a misunderstanding." She looked at him for a long moment, reading what he wouldn't say. "People can be cruel," she murmured. "You don't have to protect us, Luke." He met her gaze, voice low and firm. "Maybe I don't have to. But I want to." For a heartbeat, the air between them stilled, full of something unspoken, fragile and new. Annie's laughter from the next room broke the silence and both smiled. Luke tipped his hat, heading for the door. "See you in the mornin', Clara." And as he walked into the fading light, Clara whispered to herself, "See you tomorrow, Luke." The first snow came early that year, soft flakes drifting like feathers over the plains, dusting the world in white. To Annie Mae it looked magical. She ran outside with bare hands, catching snow on her tongue and laughing until her cheeks burned. But to Luke Calder, the sight of that early snow filled him with unease. He knew what it meant. Winter in Willow Creek wasn't kind. The sky turned gray and heavy, the sun a ghost behind the clouds. Days shortened, nights stretched long and cruel, and the cold sank deep into bone and wood alike. The well froze at its edges, the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and even the cattle at Luke's ranch grew restless, noses pressed into the icy wind. Still, Luke rode down to the Hensley cabin every day no matter how hard the snow fell. He'd bring kindling, flour, jerky, and sometimes a smile, though those grew harder to summon as December deepened. Inside, Clara's health began to falter again. The color drained from her cheeks, her cough worsened, and fever returned like an old enemy. She tried to hide it at first, forcing a smile when Luke came by, saying she just needed a bit of rest. But the truth showed in her trembling hands and the way she gripped the bed frame just to stand. Annie noticed first. "Mama, you're cuffin' too much again," she whispered one night, pressing a wet cloth to her mother's forehead. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Clara rasped, trying to sound convincing. "It's just the cold." But Luke knew better. He could hear it, that hollow rattling sound that came from deep inside her chest. It was the same sound he'd heard once before years ago when his own mother died of lung fever. He remembered the helplessness, the waiting. He couldn't stand to see it happen again. By the third week of snow, the storm came, not a gentle one, but a blizzard so fierce it buried fences and tore shingles from roofs. The world turned white and wild, the wind howling like a living thing. Luke was trapped at his ranch that first night, the snow too thick to see his own hands. He paced by the window, watching flakes lash against the glass. His gut twisted. "Claire. Eddie." When dawn finally broke, the storm still raged, but Luke didn't hesitate. He threw on his coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and saddled his horse. "Come on, bandit," he muttered, patting the horse's neck. "We got miles to go." The journey was brutal. The wind cut like knives and the snow blinded him. The horse stumbled more than once, hooves sinking deep into drifts. Luke's face stung, his fingers numbed, and more than once he thought of turning back. But then he'd see Annie's small face in his mind, her eyes filled with trust, and he pressed on. It took him nearly 3 hours to reach the cabin, a ride that should have taken one. When he finally saw the little home half buried in snow, fear shot through him. The chimney was cold, no smoke rising. He jumped off the horse and pushed through the door. Inside the air was still. The fire had gone out. Clara lay pale and still in bed, and Annie sat beside her, clutching her mother's hand, eyes red and swollen. "Luke," she cried, voice breaking. "Mama won't wake up right." He was beside them in an instant, touching Clara's forehead, burning hot. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. "She's burnin' up," Luke muttered, panic creeping into his voice. He rushed to the stove, struck a match, and began building a fire with shaking hands. "We need heat. Now." Annie helped, fetching logs, her little hands trembling. Luke wrapped Clara in every blanket he could find, then knelt beside her, whispering softly, "Hold on, Clara. Don't you go giving up now." He stayed through the night, feeding the fire and wiping her brow with snowmelt water. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside the small cabin, a different battle raged, one of breath, prayer, and sheer will. When the fever didn't break by morning, Luke knew what he had to do. "I'm riding for Doc Murphy," he said, standing. "It's a 2-day ride, but I'll make it." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "But the storm." "I've faced worse," he lied. "You just keep that fire going, Annie girl. Don't let it die. You hear me?" She nodded, lip trembling. "I'll keep it burnin', Mr. Luke." The ride to Willow Creek was worse than anything Luke had ever endured. The snow came sideways, cutting visibility to nothing. He couldn't feel his fingers, and his horse stumbled more than once. But he didn't stop. Every heartbeat echoed the same thought: get the doctor. Don't let her die. He reached town just as the last light of day faded, half frozen, his face raw from the wind. He burst into the doctor's office, nearly collapsing against the doorframe. "Doc Murphy," he gasped, "Clara Hensley's down bad. Fever. Coughin', blood. You gotta come." The old doctor looked up from his desk, eyes widening. "In this storm? That's suicide, Luke." Luke's jaw tightened. "Then I'll ride with you." Murphy hesitated, then sighed, grabbing his bag. "You always were stubborn as a mule." "All right. Let's go save her." The return trip was slower, the storm heavier. Twice they had to stop and rest the horses, the cold biting through their coats. But Luke didn't care about himself anymore. All he saw was Clara's face, pale and still, fighting for breath. They reached the cabin just before dawn on the second day. Annie burst through the door at the sound of hooves, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's still breathin', but barely." Doc Murphy hurried to her side while Luke fed the fire higher. The doctor worked in silence for what felt like hours, mixing medicine, whispering instructions, wrapping her chest in warm cloths. Luke stood nearby, watching every move, his heart pounding like a drum. Finally, Doc Murphy exhaled and looked up. "She's fightin'. Stronger than she looks. Might just make it." Annie threw her arms around Luke, sobbing. "You saved her, Mr. Luke. You saved my mama." Luke swallowed hard, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. "No, Annie girl. Your mama's the one who did the fightin'." He turned to look at Clara, her breathing slow but steady now. The color was creeping back into her cheeks, faint but there. He reached out, brushed a stray lock of hair from her face and whispered, almost to himself, "Don't you ever scare me like that again." That night, after the doctor left, Luke sat by the fire, watching over Clara and Annie as they slept. Snow still fell outside, soft now, no longer a storm but a blanket. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. For the first time in years, the fire inside him wasn't just for survival. It was for them. For her. And as he drifted into sleep, the last thing he heard was Clara's soft whisper, weak but clear. "Luke, thank you." Spring came late that year. The snow lingered like a stubborn ghost before the sun finally broke through the clouds and melted the drifts into muddy rivers. Green returned to the fields, birds sang again, and life crept back to the valley. For Clara Hensley, recovery came slowly, a long and fragile climb from the edge of death. There were days she could barely rise, and others when she walked to the doorway just to feel the sun on her face. Luke Calder had stayed longer than he ever meant to, chopping firewood, repairing the roof, and tending the small patch of garden Annie and her mother had once kept alive. He didn't do it out of pity. He did it because every morning when he saw Annie's bright eyes and Clara's quiet gratitude, something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt since before the war. By April, Clara could stand on her own again. Her voice was still soft, her body frail, but her spirit burned strong. One afternoon she found Luke outside fixing the fence. Annie sat nearby, plaiting a crown of wildflowers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. "You've done too much for us already," Clara said gently, stepping toward him. "I can't keep asking you to stay." Luke paused, resting a hand on the fence post. "You didn't ask," he said, glancing her way. "I just never saw reason to leave." Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes flickered with something. "Worry maybe?" "The town's been talking again," she admitted. "Saying things about you, and me." Luke's expression hardened. "Let him talk." "It's not that simple," she whispered. "You've got a reputation, a good one. Folks respect you. They'll think that I care about a woman who's been through hell?" he interrupted softly. "They'd be right." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment neither spoke. Annie's laughter broke the silence, chasing a butterfly across the yard. Luke cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the weight of his own words. "Anyway," he muttered, tightening the wire, "someone's gotta keep this place standin'. You and Annie deserve that." But Clara saw through the gruffness. She saw the man who'd risked his life through a blizzard, who'd held her hand when she was too weak to breathe, who'd become the father figure her daughter never had. Still she worried. The world wasn't kind to women like her, widowed, poor, dependent. And it was crueler still to men who helped them. When Luke rode into Willow Creek a week later for supplies, the whispers followed him like dust. "Did you hear? That Calder fella's livin' out at the Hensley place," one woman said near the general store, her voice dripping with judgment. "Poor man's lost his mind," another replied. "Keepin' company with a widow who's barely on her feet. Ain't proper." Luke heard it all, the muttered gossip, the sideways glances, but he kept his jaw set and eyes forward. He wasn't the kind of man to defend himself with words. But that changed when he walked into the saloon. Old Grant Dawson, a cattleman with too much whiskey and too little sense, was sitting at the bar bragging loud. "You all hear about Calder?" he snorted. "Seems the mighty Cowboy's turned nursemaid to that sickly widow. Maybe she's got something worth staying for, if you catch my man. The room erupted in laughter. Luke stopped dead in the doorway. The air went cold. He crossed the room slow, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The laughter died as he reached Dawson's table. "You got something to say about Clara Hensley?" Luke asked, voice low. Dawson smirked, leaning back. "Just speaking truth, friend. You think no one notices how often you're out there? Man spends that much time with a woman, folks are bound to wonder." Luke's hand tightened on the edge of the table. "You open your mouth about her again and wonderin' will be the last thing you do." Dawson chuckled. "You threatenin' me, Calder?" "No," Luke said, his voice turning to steel. "I'm promisin' you." Then, without warning, his fist connected with Dawson's jaw. The man went down hard, his chair splintering beneath him. The room gasped as Dawson hit the floor, spitting blood and curses. Luke stood over him, breathing hard. "Clara Hensley is more woman than you'll ever be man. You keep her name out of your mouth." He turned and walked out, the saloon falling silent behind him. By the time Luke rode back to the cabin that evening, word had already spread. Clara was waiting on the porch, arms folded, worry etched into her face. "Luke Calder, what have you done?" she asked softly. He dismounted slowly, brushing snow from his coat. "Just said my piece. I heard you hit Grant Dawson." Luke met her gaze. "Then you heard right." Clara sighed, shaking her head. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He stepped closer, his tone low but firm. "You've done nothing but survive. You've raised that little girl alone, fought sickness, fought hunger, and folks still think they can tear you down. Not while I'm around." Clara's eyes glistened. "Why, Luke? Why risk your name for us?" He hesitated, searching her face. "Because your little girl reminded me what decency looks like. Because you made this place feel like home again." His voice softened. "And because I care, Clara. More than I should." The words hung in the air, heavy and trembling. For a long moment she couldn't speak. Then she reached out, laying a hand against his chest, tentative, gentle. "Luke," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But before either could say more, a small voice piped up from behind the door. "Mama. Mr. Luke. I caught a frog." Annie burst out, beaming, holding the muddy creature in both hands. Luke laughed, the tension easing, and Clara smiled through tears. "Better wash up, sweetheart," Clara said. "Dinner's near." As Annie ran off, Luke lingered for a moment longer on the porch, meeting Clara's gaze one last time. There was no need for more words. The promise between them had already been made, not spoken but written in the way they looked at each other. He tipped his hat slightly and said, "I'll be back tomorrow. Got a fence to finish." And as he rode away under the fading orange sky, Clara watched him go, her heart finally daring to hope again. The days grew longer and the valley bloomed again. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, the creek sang louder, and the air held that sweet scent of renewal. But for Luke Calder, peace didn't come easy. Ever since that day in the saloon, things in Willow Creek had changed. Men he'd once called friends looked away when he entered a room. Women stopped talking when he passed by. The preacher, who had always nodded kindly on Sundays, now spoke sharper sermons about the appearance of sin. And still Luke kept riding out to the Hensley cabin. He told himself it was to help fix the barn roof, or mend the garden fence, or bring medicine for Clara's cough. But deep down he knew the truth. He came because that small cabin, with its smoke curling up into the sky and a little girl laughing inside, had become his refuge, the only place that felt right. One morning Luke found Clara outside, kneeling in the soil. She was planting wildflowers with Annie, her hands still frail but steady. The sight made something in his chest tighten. "You ought to be restin'," he said softly as he approached. Clara looked up, smiling. "Restin' don't grow flowers." Annie giggled and handed him a small trowel. "You can help too, Mr. Luke." He knelt beside them, the soil cool beneath his hands. Together, the three planted bright blue lupins in front of the cabin. When they finished, Clara brushed her hair from her face, smudged with dirt, and said, "I reckon it's good to see color again. Reminds me there's still beauty out here, even after all that's happened." Luke looked at her, the sunlight catching her hair. "There's always been beauty, Clara. Just needed someone strong enough to see it." Her eyes met his, soft and uncertain. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had gone still. But before either could speak, the sound of wagon wheels broke the moment. A wagon came up the hill, carrying Pastor Wilburn and two men from town. Luke's shoulders stiffened immediately. The pastor stepped down first, his face grim. "Mornin', Miss Hensley." "Mr. Calder." "Pastor," Clara greeted cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. "To what do we owe the visit?" Wilburn looked between them, his gaze heavy with disapproval. "There's talk in town, ugly talk. About impropriety. About you two livin' out here, unwed with no family." Clara's face flushed. "That's not true," she whispered. Luke's jaw clenched. "You're sayin' a man can't help a neighbor without it being gossip?" The pastor sighed. "Luke, you've been a good man and I know your heart's decent. But people judge what they see. You're stayin' here too often. You should think of Miss Hensley's reputation. Of Annie's future." Luke stepped closer. "I am thinkin' of their future." One of the townsmen spat in the dirt. "Ain't right, Calder. If you mean to play family with her, make it proper. If not, best you stay away." Clara's voice trembled. "Please, we've done nothing wrong." Wilburn looked at her with pity. "Sometimes, child, righteousness ain't about what's true, it's about what folks believe." Luke felt something inside him snap. "You tell those folks," he said, voice low and hard, "that I don't live by their talk. I live by what's right. And right now, what's right is keepin' this woman and her little girl safe." The pastor's face softened, but the judgment remained. "Then marry her, Luke. That's how you feel. Make it right before God and man." With that, they turned and rode off, leaving dust and silence behind. Clara sank down on the porch steps, her hands trembling. "Oh, I'm sorry," she whispered. "You shouldn't have to defend me. Not again." He crouched beside her, eyes searching hers. "You got nothing to be sorry for." "But it's hurting you," she said, her voice breaking. "Your ranch, your name, people are tennin' against you because of me." Luke shook his head slowly. "Let him. I've been alone long enough, Clara. I don't aim to lose what matters now just 'cause some small minds can't see past their noses." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "And what is it that matters, Luke?" He didn't speak at first. Then softly, "You and that little girl." Clara's lips parted in surprise, tears spilling silently. "Oh, I don't deserve." "Don't say that." He took her hands gently in his. "You deserve a man who'll stand beside you when the world turns away. Someone who sees your strength, not your scars." For a long moment they sat like that, hands joined, eyes locked, as the breeze stirred the wildflowers they'd just planted. Then Annie came running from the creek, shouting, "Mama! Mr. Luke! Look, I caught a fish." Clara laughed through her tears and Luke smiled, watching the little girl's joy. He rose and helped Clara to her feet. "Go on, Annie girl, show your mama." As the child ran ahead, Luke turned to Clara again. You don't owe the town a thing, Clara. But if you'll have me, his voice faltered. Maybe we can give them something real to talk about. Her eyes widened, not in fear but in quiet wonder. Luke, are you a skin me? He gave a small sheepish smile. Reckon I am. Maybe not fancy-like but straight from the heart. Clara covered her mouth, a soft laugh escaping her. You sure you know what you're getting into? He chuckled. I do. Trouble and all. And there, beneath the wide blue sky, with spring birds singing and Annie laughing by the water, Clara whispered the words that changed everything. Yes, Luke. I'll have you. That night, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight. For the first time in years, Clara's heart felt light, not from rescue but from belonging. Luke sat by the fire, Annie curled against his arm, fast asleep. Clara watched them quietly, her hand resting over her heart. Outside, the wind carried away the last chill of winter, and for the first time since her husband died, she whispered a prayer, not for strength but for gratitude. The wedding was small, just a handful of folks who still believed in decency over gossip. It took place on a soft May morning in the little white church at Willow Creek, sunlight streaming through the windows like grace itself. Clara wore a simple blue dress Annie had helped mend, her hair braided and pinned with wildflowers Luke had gathered himself. Luke stood tall beside her, freshly shaven, his hat held respectfully in his hands. When Pastor Wilburn read the vows, his voice carried a hint of humility, as if he finally understood the strength it took for two wounded souls to choose hope again. I now pronounce you husband and wife, he said softly. May the Lord bless this home you build together. The congregation was quiet. A few nodded approvingly, others whispered. But when Luke reached for Clara's hand and she smiled, a real radiant smile, the whispers faded. Annie clapped her little hands shouting joyfully, Mama's got a husband. And I got a pa. Laughter rippled through the pews, and even the coldest hearts softened. Outside, the spring breeze carried the church bell's sound across the valley. Luke lifted Clara's hand and kissed it gently, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Told you I'd give them something real to talk about. Clara's eyes shone. You surely did, Mr. Calder. For a while life was good. The Hensley cabin became the Calder homestead, a place of laughter, hard work, and quiet love. Luke repaired the barn, planted new crops, and taught Annie to ride a pony of her own. Clara tended the garden and nursed the weak back to health in the nearby town, gaining respect even from those who'd once whispered behind her back. But the peace didn't last. One summer afternoon, Luke returned from town to find Annie crying on the porch. Pa, she sobbed, running into his arms. They broke Mama's jars, the ones she put by the window. He knelt down, heart sinking. Who did this, Annie girl? I don't know, she sniffled. Two boys from town came by, said Mama's no real wife, that you only married her out of pity. Luke's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, fury burning behind his calm eyes. Inside, Clara knelt by the broken glass, sweeping quietly. Her face was pale but her hands steady. Don't, she said before he could speak. Don't go looking for a fight, Luke. He set his hat down hard on the table. Clara, they came here. They scared her. I know, she said softly, meeting his gaze. But if we fight every battle, we'll never know peace. Folks will see who we are, not by our anger but by how we live. Luke stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. You're stronger than any man I've known. She smiled faintly. That's only 'cause I got someone to be strong for. The next Sunday the Calder family walked into town together. Clara held Annie's hand, Luke walking beside them. The streets grew quiet as they passed. A few people turned away, others watched openly, curious. Luke tipped his hat to each of them, refusing to bow his head in shame. Clara did the same, her chin high, her steps sure. Annie skipped between them, humming. When they reached the church, Pastor Wilburn stood at the door, looking uneasy. Luke, Mrs. Calder, he corrected himself. Good to see you. Good to be seen, Luke replied evenly. Inside, whispers swirled again, but this time, they met silence when Annie climbed onto the pew, turned around and waved at everyone. This is my mama and my pa, she announced proudly, her voice echoing through the church. They're good people. Laughter broke out, soft and warm. A few heads nodded. And for the first time, no one shushed her. Clara smiled down at her daughter, tears gathering in her eyes. Luke took her hand, squeezing gently. The preacher's sermon that day was about forgiveness, about how sometimes folks need to see love before they can understand it. And as the congregation watched the little family sitting together, something in the room shifted. Judgment gave way to quiet respect. That autumn, the fields around the Calder homestead turned gold. The cabin stood sturdy, smoke curling from its chimney, flowers blooming along the fence line they'd built together. Luke worked the fields while Annie chased the chickens, giggling. Clara stood on the porch, watching them both with a smile that reached her soul. When Luke finished, he came to her side, wiping sweat from his brow. "You ever think we'd come this far?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not in my wildest dreams." He slipped an arm around her waist. "Well, I reckon dreams are just plans waitin' on courage." Clara looked out over the fields, the home that had once been nothing but survival, now a place of peace. "Then you gave me that courage," Luke called her. He smiled, eyes soft. "No, Clara. You found it yourself. I just happened to be there to see it." Annie's laughter rang out again, bright and unburdened. She ran to them, holding out a wildflower she'd picked. "For you, Mama. And one for you, Pa." Luke took it carefully, tucking it behind Clara's ear. "You've got a good heart, little one," he said. Clara bent down, kissing her daughter's forehead. "She's got yours," she whispered. That night, under a blanket of stars, the three sat by the fire outside. The crickets sang, the creek murmured in the distance, and peace, true peace, settled around them. Clara leaned her head on Luke's shoulder. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked softly. Luke thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not a bit. I've got all I need right here." He looked down at Annie asleep on Clara's lap, then at the cabin glowing softly in the dark. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think I was meant to ride alone forever." Clara smiled against his shoulder. "Guess the Lord had other plans." "Reckon he did." And as the fire crackled low and the stars wheeled above them, Luke Calder, once the loneliest cowboy in Willow Creek, knew he'd found his home. Not the kind you build from timber and stone, but the kind you build from love, courage, and the soft laughter of a little girl who once went to the well alone.